Well, it's good to be here, and nice to see a good crowd and some of my students, which is lovely. Okay, this talk is based upon a class that I used to give in a course called Ancient Laughter, in which I concentrated on Roman satire, and one of the common themes, or recurrent themes of Roman satire, is the dining party, the dinner party, which can be seen as a way into an investigation of social behaviour and conduct and mores. So without any more ado, I'll just get stuck in. If anything I say you don't get, just please interrupt. I'm quite happy with that, as my students know. So, introduction. You are what you eat is a cliche. One could also say that the way in which one eats is a strong indicator of how one behaves in general, an indicator of the social stratum in which one moves. One could go farther and say that the dinner party and its conversation gives the valuable insight into the manners and ideology of any given society. All the Roman satirists, from the time of Lucilius in the 2nd century BC or BCE, produced works which depicted in varying ways the dinner party. The genre of satire, as developed by the Romans as a poetic literary form, was in fact a Roman invention, perhaps their sole literary invention. All the other genres were borrowed and developed from the Greeks. And Roman satire demonstrates a capacity for mocking self-criticism born of a basic confidence in the rightness of the Roman way and the customs of the ancestors, the mores maiorum, as it's said. Although the different writers of Roman satire, and we're talking of a period of some 200 years when the genre was especially in vogue, had different agenda, Lucilius, Horace, Juvenal, Petronius, nevertheless each found the dinner party a suitable subject for treatment, while the actual structure and rituals, the succession of courses, the slaves attending, the various entertainments accompanying a dinner party, these provided a structure ready-made for the composition of a poem by Horace or Juvenal, or in Petronius' case, in the time of Nero, a ready-made structure for the description of a banquet. They're known as, in Latin, the cena trimalchionis. Cena simply means a banquet or a meal, and trimalchionis of trimalchio, a freedman, very wealthy, and an idiot. The banquet of Trimalchio, quite possibly, was part of the inspiration for the Great Gatsby of Scott Fitzgerald, incidentally. Okay. A few words about the party or the dinner party in earlier literature. The symposium, which means, of course, a drinking together, was in ancient Greek society an opportunity to enjoy food, drink, conversation, and other entertainments, music, flute girls, and the like. It was generally a masculine pursuit, one has to say. As early as the time of Plato and Xenophon in the 4th century BCE, the symposium was used by these authors as a setting for philosophical works in which Socrates and others, Aristophanes, for example, the comic poet, debated important issues: the nature of love, the definition of justice or virtue. An old friend of mine, Francis Mukie from the University of Sydney, wrote a book on Horace, Satires, Book 2, and she gives a very useful brief history of the subgenre of symposiastic writing and its place in the Roman satirical tradition. She also talks about how important the topic of food itself is in the 2nd book of Horace's Satires, and I'll quote from her introduction to her commentary. In Horace's contemporary social environment, food was the site of competing cultural values. On the one hand, the pursuit of pleasure or prestige through competitive and ostentatious extravagance. On the other, legal regulation of expenditure and the moral condemnation prompted by the traditional association of luxury with decadence. The old Roman diet was under pressure from fads of fashion and the authority of gastronomical experts. Gossip about the latest scandalous excess or new dish was a source of vicarious enjoyment, with the added spice of moral disapproval easily thrown in. That's the end of the quotation.
They didn't have McDonald's, did they?
No, they didn't have McDonald's, but they did have roadside stalls. Food is mentioned in every satire and is of central importance in satires 2, 4, 6 and 8. Indeed, the dinner parties and the consumption of food become part of the staple diet, if I may put it that way, of the readers of Roman satire, from the time of Horace in the 1st century BCE. Conspicuous consumption is an index of wealth and its abuse, and the dinner party provides an environment wherein the true class of an individual, whether host or patron or guest client, can be accurately assessed. As well as the dinner parties described in Horace and Juvenal, there is in Horace Satires 2:2 a homily on food and moderate consumption put into the mouth of one traditional Italian yeoman, aptly named Ophelus, which means, I think, titbit. There is a mock academic lecture on the art of the chef by one Teece in Satires 2:4, and of course the largest continuous fragment of the Satyricon of Petronius describes in vivid detail the dinner party of Trimalchio, as I mentioned already, the cena Trimalchionis, where many different satirical threads are drawn together. The patron-client relationship, the use and abuse of personal wealth and the vice of luxuria, the relationship between poetry, music and life, the abuse of the innate sexual instincts of the human individual. It is as well to remember that these recurrent topics of satire frequently intersect and interlock, such that sexual abuse is often linked with the pursuit of wealth, for example, while all the perceived social ills are linked in that they often are seen as the result of the abandonment of traditional ways of living, of the mores maiorum, the customs of the ancestors, or an abandonment of the more strictly moral philosophies which may be seen to have superseded previously uncritically or irrationally held views. This is particularly true of the messages present in the Satires of Juvenal from approximately 110 to 150 AD or CE. But anticipatory hints are to be found if expressed in a less trenchant and more subtle manner in the works of his predecessors. I'm going to quote from several of the satirists, and I'll start now with a quotation from Horace Satires 2:6. And I think you'll find that this is a familiar story. Once upon a time, they say, you sit comfortably, and I'll begin. Once upon a time, they say, a country mouse entertained a town mouse in his poor burrow, host and guest being friends of all. He was rough and careful with his store, but so as, nevertheless, to loosen his tight disposition for hospitality's sake. I say more. He was not one to grudge the chickpea he had put away, nor the long oat, and bringing them in his mouth, he offered a raisin and half-eaten morsels of bacon, wishing by the variety of his meal to overcome his friend's disdain, as he scarcely touched them one by one with his contemptuous tooth, while the father of the house himself stretched out on fresh chaff, ate emmer wheat and damo, leaving the better part of the feast. Now, to cut a long story short, the country mouse is inveigled into sampling the joys, shall we say, of the big smoke Rome. When the two friends plant their footsteps in a rich house in Rome, many a dish was left over from a great dinner in baskets piled up aside from the day before. When he had settled the countryman in place, stretched out on the crimson coverlet, the host, with his clothes tucked up like a waiter's, scurries around and keeps the feast coming, and also performs himself the duties of a home-born slave, licking everything he brings in first, when suddenly a huge crash of doors scathed them both off the couches. They ran in fright all over the dining room, and their terrified panic was greater as soon as the high house resounded with Molossian hounds. Then the countryman said, "Well, you don't need this kind of life. And farewell, my burrow in the woods, safe and surprise attack will keep me happy with simple fare." Pardon me. Okay. So, the folk tale of the town mouse and the country mouse is utilised by Horace as kind of myth at the end of his satire, kind of Platonic myth almost, to make a stark contrast between his desired life of Epicurean calm in the country, with withdrawal in the country from the hurly-burly of city life, as Horace describes it in one of his odes, fumum strepitumque Romae, the smoke and din of Rome, and the dangers of the urban environment. One could say a little bit about Horace. He was virtually a poet laureate after Virgil in Rome at the time of the changing of the eras in the time of Augustus. He had received as a gift from his patron a country farm in the Sabine Hills, and his joy was to spend his time there with his friends in a kind of Epicurean idyll. But to pay for his gift, if you like, from his patron Maecenas, he also had to fulfill officia, or duties, in the city of Rome. And so there's a kind of tension which is reflected in this little part, this satire 2:6. Moving on, the excessive interest in the science of food and cooking is satirized by Horace in the fourth satire of this second book, where an individual, Teece, subjects the long-suffered Horace to an extended lecture on haute cuisine. And this reminds me of celebrity chefs, which you're all familiar with, of course. And so I quote, this is Teece speaking, using the language and the style of a philosopher to discuss how to make boiled eggs and so on. Eggs which are long in shape, forget not to serve those, as they are of a better flavour and are whiter than the round. For they are hard-skinned and contain a male yolk. Nothing tastes more washed out than over-watered garden stuff. In order that a tough hen does not disappoint the palate, show your knowledge by drowning it alive in juice from Falernian grapes. Field mushrooms are the best kind. If your bowels are constipated and slow, sea mussels and sheep shellfish will expel the blockage. And the short-stalked sorrel, of course, with white wine from Kos. And so he goes on for a couple of hundred lines in very highfalutin style. The satirical point is that Claptius is using a lecturing style, suited to formal discussions of ethics and theology for the discussion of such a basic subject as food and its preparation. The countryman of Phallus, in Satires 2:2, denies the use of Greek terms, as a good Italian should, to discuss ethics, but his work is littered with necessarily Greek terms. Horace gives his fullest description of a dinner party, a farcical dinner party, in his last satire, book 2, number 8. And I'll paraphrase the content of the poem. Horace meets Fundanius, a comic poet, and asks him to describe a dinner party he had recently attended at the house of one Nasidianus in the company of Maecenas. Fundanius begins by describing the food and the wine and the manner of service, setting the scene for the comedy of errors, the farce which ensued. Fundanius lists the guests by name and gives the seating plan. Character sketches of the individuals fade into descriptions of behaviour. Nasidianus, the host, and his name means something to do with the nose, takes great delight in giving a running commentary, very detailed and arguably rather pretentious, on the food and its preparation and the wine, the haute cuisine. Two of Maecenas' companions promise to drink up large, much to the host's horror. The point is that Nasidianus is trying to impress by the dinner party the grand gentleman Maecenas, so that he can advance himself, climb socially into Maecenas' circle. And that's a theme in Horace's satires elsewhere as well. Okay, the main course is served, and it is described in length and with great satisfaction by this man Nasidianus. A moray eel stretched out in the dish, amid swimming scampi. Thereupon the master, that's the host, says, "This was caught pregnant, since after spawning it will deteriorate in the flesh. The sauce is mixed from the following: oil which is the Venafran seller's first pressing, fish sauce from the juices of Spanish fish, 5-year-old wine, but originating on this side of the sea, while it is being heated, once it has been heated, Chian suits best, white pepper with vinegar, which through spoiling has soured the Bithynian grape." And see the detail through which he describes with great satisfaction the lengths that he's gone to provide an excellent dinner for Maecenas. So Nasidianus, the nose, plays the role of the gourmet, I would say galloping gourmet, with relish. He takes centre stage in the little drama which is being narrated by the comic poet Fundanius, which sets him up for the disastrous accident which brings proceedings to a premature end. Towards the end of the poem, the awning over the diners collapses in a heap of dust and debris. Nasidienis is devastated by what he takes to be a tragedy, which is described by Fundanius, a comic poet, as a farce. Nasidienis is a figure which might inspire so much sympathy in the modern readership. He then philosophizes on life's uncertainty and is made mock of by the friends, rather ill-mannered friends of Maecenas. The host withdraws to make new arrangements for food, but in his absence the drinking continues, and when he finally arrives with fresh dishes, the guests depart in a gale of ungenerous, cruel and drunken laughter. So that could tell us all sorts of things about the mores of the time, social climate and so on. And Francis says, the point of the satire is also debated. Is it just a divertissement, a comedy of manners, or does it have a moral message? Most Roman poetry does have a moral message. Nasidie's fault is not meanness, but vulgar affectation, stupidity, social ambition and vanity. In spite of his own boring culinary disquisitions, he is ignorant of the art of dining well. And Cicero, the great orator, sometime philosopher or pretend philosopher, said in one of his works that the principal dish of a good dinner is, any guesses from Cicero?
Conversation.
Good conversation, exactly right. Chocolate fish for you. Maecenas and his friends represent the society to which Nasidienis aspires, from which he is disqualified by his vulgarity and lack of savoir-faire. To a certain extent, Nasidienis is on the right track when he tries to impress Maecenas by luxuriousness of food and drink, but he badly misjudges the situation in thinking that that is all that is required. Horatian satire, like satire often, is a double-edged sword, and the behaviour of Maecenas and his cronies suggests that, like the town mouse, their society and company may not be as desirable as at first sight appeared to Nasidienis. I'll take this off if you don't mind. I would think the day when it was 25 degrees. Okay. The idea of the wealthy upstart aping the behaviour of his betters is taken to new heights, or perhaps depths, in Petronius Arpida's description of the provincial dinner party in his novel The Satyricon, or sometimes called Satirica, famously filmed by the Italian director Fellini. And I can recommend that if you get hold of it on YouTube or on DVD. It's a great film. You need a strong stomach, but still a great film. The most ambitious treatment of the dinner party that we have in Roman satirical writing is Petronius's largest surviving fragment of the fragmentary novel. And I'll just paraphrase some of what happens, and then we'll talk about the meaning of the dinner party. Encolpius, who is the hero or the anti-hero, and his friends, his company of wayward saints, meet Trimalchio, an old freedman, extremely rich, that he's an ex-slave. They meet him taking exercise, they go to the baths with him, and they make their way to his house. Immediately the emphasis is on the ostentatious expenditure and the idiosyncratic manner of the host, including his devotion to music. Everything he does is accompanied by music. Each dish is served accompanied by music, and so on. As so the dish falls on the floor, he scolds the slave who picks it up, because once it's fallen on the floor, it is not to be used again. Okay, this is an index of his wealth, if you like. They enter the house, and the terrifying dog which guards the door turns out to be not real, rather a mosaic. Trimalchio's life history is illustrated in a lengthy mural with mythical advantages, while it is clear that in his household his mastery is supreme. This ex-slave is the king, he is the emperor. In Latin terms, he is ipse, the man himself, the master of the revels, the arbiter elegantiae, which is what Petronius was called, the arbiter of elegance in the court of Nero. That is, Petronius, at least that's what we believe. He's also depicted as being a prey to superstition, as apparently was the Emperor Augustus. So what we can say is that this banquet in provincial Italy, hosted by this nouveau riche upstart with no taste at all and all the wealth to indulge it, is probably to be seen as a kind of parody of the court of Nero, in which Petronius himself played a central part. So that's the kind of guts of the reading of the banquet. The gustatio, or the appetizers, are served. A medley of elegant dishes are served on serving ware, which was itself composed of a mimetic work of art, a brazen ass. This motif of having sculpted animals, whether in precious metals or food, as containers for the dishes, continues throughout the meal. Trimalchio makes an astonishing entrance. He comes in, his bald head thrusting out of rich cushions, and the narrator tells us that we could barely restrain our giggles as this happened. So his initial utterances betray an ostentatious, if ungracious, concern for his guests' well-being. Another novelty, a wooden hen, is introduced sitting on peahen's eggs, which are themselves pieces of imitation and trickery. With the introduction of the first serving of wine, reputed to be a century old, Trimalchio plays with a toy skeleton, which gives him the opportunity to wax philosophical on the briefness of life's candle and the inevitability of death. And this is a motif which continues, as my students know, throughout the banquet of Trimalchio. Even as Trimalchio's dishes are artificial concoctions served on dishes which pretend to be other than their actual reality of wood or metal, even so his philosophizing is second-hand and inaccurate, borrowed badly from various sources, as later on in his table talk about music, literature and art, he displays his ignorance. Trimalchio's whole life is a desperate sham, where the ostentatious gratification of every appetite for food, wine, sex and song is a vain, desperate attempt to escape the realization that his life had no real merit or meaning, much like his dinner party. The connection between art and the kind of reality emerges again later on in paragraph 40, when after embroidered scenes of hunting are described on the tablecloths, real hunting hounds are introduced, and the fruit of the hunt is served a huge boar, which turns out to be a receptacle in disguise, for flocks of thrushes fly out when the beast is carved, only to be captured and served immediately to the guests as takeaway presents. In a sense, the follies of the aristocratic table, attacked earlier by Horace, have reached epic proportions here in a novel which is based itself, in fact, on a parody of the epic genre mastered by Homer and Virgil. So the structure of the Satyricon as a novel is in some ways based upon the structure of the Aeneid. The anti-hero Encolpius is pursued by the anger of Priapus, who makes him impotent in the same way as that Aeneas in the Aeneid is pursued by the anger of Juno. Okay. Just another passage which was vividly demonstrated in Fellini's film version. While he was speaking, 4 dancers ran in to the time of the music and removed the upper part of the tray. Beneath, on what seemed to be another tray, we caught sight of stuffed capons and sows' bellies, and in the middle a hare equipped with wings to resemble Pegasus. At the corners of the tray we also noted 4 figures of Marsyas, and from their bladders spouted a highly spiced sauce upon the fish, which was swimming about as if in a tide race. All of us echoed the applause, which was started by the servants, and fell to upon these exquisite delicacies with a laugh. "Carver!" cried Trimalchio, no less delighted with the artifice practised upon us, and the carver immediately appeared. Timing his strokes to the beat of the music, he cut up the meat in such a fashion as to lead you to think that a gladiator was fighting from a chariot to the accompaniment of a water organ. Every now and then Trimalchio would repeat, "Carver, carver, carver, carver," in a low voice, until I finally came to the conclusion that some joke was meant in repeating a word so frequently. So I did not scruple to question him who reclined above me in the seating order. As he had often experienced byplay of this sort, he explained, "You see that fellow who's carving the meat, don't you? Well, his name is Carver. Whenever Trimalchio says Carver, Carver, by the same word he both calls and commands." Great. The lowest form of humour. An interesting aspect of this dinner party is the quality of the guests. Largely freed men or ex-slaves. That is, nouveau riche made good, replete, as I said, with bad taste. When the host departs temporarily for a visit to empty his bowels, as he proudly tells us later, the freedmen take the opportunity, relieved of his tyrannical presence, to speak freely in their own ungrammatical patois, pronouncing commonplace wisdom, casting clichés, which of course enables them to avoid the tedious and demanding process of independent thought. In the 20th century, many scholars thought that these guys were a refreshing change to the over-sophisticated language of their betters. I think that's complete nonsense. Could use another word. Anyway, let's read a passage from one of these freedmen. You can see what I mean about their homespun wisdom, where they speak in clichés, which, as I say, precludes the need to actually think, because they have a knee-jerk reaction to any situation. "I don't bathe every day," he confided. "A bath uses you up like a fuller. Water's got teeth and your strength wastes away a little every day. But when I down a pot of mead, I tell the cold to suck my cock. I couldn't bathe today anyway, because I was at a funeral. Handy fellow he was too. Good old Chrysanthus slipped his wind. Why, on it t'other day, he said good morning to me, and I almost think I'm talking to him now. God's truth, we're only blown up bladders strutting around, we're less than flies, for they are some good in them, but we're only bubbles. And supposing he had not kept to such a low diet, why, not a drop of water or a crumb of bread so much as passed his lips for 5 days, and yet he joined the great majority. Too many doctors did away with him, or rather his time had come. For a doctor's not good for hope, but consolation in your mind. He was well carried out, anyway, in the very bed he slept in during his lifetime, and he was covered with a splendid pall. The mourning was tastefully managed. He had freed some slaves, even though his wife was sparing him with her tears. And what if he hadn't treated us so well? But when he comes to women, women all belong to kite species. No one ought to waste a good turn upon one of them. It's just like throwing money down a well. And old love's like a cancer. Sexist. Working class, if you like. Not particularly admirable. Forget about the lovable working class. I grew up where that accent came from. The banquet of Trimalchio provides a pathetic and grossly comic figure as master of the feast, entertaining his guests in the only way he knows how, extravagantly, with ostentatious and tasteless show, all the time preoccupied with the fear of death, and attempting vainly to alleviate that fear by submerging every sense, physical and psychological, in a welter of overstimulation. Does the master of the feast represent the master of Rome at the time? The notoriously extravagant and immoral Emperor Nero? Well, maybe. What is interesting, that in Tacitus, the great historian's history, is the suicide of Petronius is described in detail. And Petronius, if he is the author, commits suicide in an Epicurean fashion, in that he drinks, eats, has a good time with his friends, writes a diary about all Nero's sexual proclivities, and then finally says goodbye to this life. It is a kind of answer to the serious Stoic suicides which were common among the Republican Party at the time. That's practiced by, for example, Seneca. So now we move on to the man whom, as I said this morning to my Latin 2 class, Gilbert Hyatt, a classicist of the 20th century, described as the finest satirist who ever lived. Decimus Junius Juvenalis, juvenile to me and you, who composed satires at Rome at the beginning of the 2nd century CE, who famously declared on contemplating contemporary Rome, difficile est satiram non scribere. It's difficult not to write satire. In his 5th satire, he gives a description of a dinner party. Okay. The 5th satire of Juvenal is an immediate follow-up to a comment upon Satire 4. In that poem, the immediately previous one, the behaviour of the dinner party host Virro is parallel to the behaviour of the tyrannical Emperor Domitian in the previous poem. In Satire 5, that's what takes place. The tone for the relationship between patron and client is now set by the emperor, whose aim in the events described in Satire 4 was to terrorize his powerful clients for his own amusement. Virro, the host in Satire 5, subjects his more humble client guests to humiliation and second-rate food, wine and service to provide amusement for himself and his rich friends, breaking all the rules of polite society in Rome, as exemplified by, for example, the letter writer Pliny the Younger. At the same time, the satirical comment is directed not only at the host, but at the guests who allow themselves to be thus humiliated in the quest for a free meal. Juvenal's point emerges that a man who can subject himself to the debasement meted out by Virro, the host, is no longer worthy of the title Roman. The debasement is of an institution which had once been honourable. The relationship between the cliens, that's the client, a man of more humble status, and the patron, a man of a wealthy and powerful individual who would foster the career of his junior in return for help and support in, for example, his own political career. Sounds a bit like what we listened to the last week or so, it seems to me. Okay, well, there you go, yes about that. Juvenal gives an account of what the dinner party actually means to both the patron and the client. For the former, the patron, it is the cheapest way of discharging his obligations to such a client as Trebius for services rendered. The humiliated clients are also a source of amusement. The client is willing to abase himself for a free meal. The thing is a perverse and mercenary business arrangement and a perversion of an honourable institution which, along with political marriages and political friendships, amicitia, was part of the glue which helped to hold Roman society together. In the eyes of the satirists, Juvenal, that society was on the point of moral collapse or moral free fall. Okay. The host is even termed by Juvenal Rex, king, at verse 14, early on in the poem, where Rex, king, had long been a pejorative term in Roman society since the expulsion of the kings from Rome so many hundreds of years before. Okay. Let's look at the meal. Cheap wine was provided to the lesser clients. It was calculated to make them get quickly drunk so that their betters could take amusement from their out-of-control antics. This could amuse the high table, if you like. Virro, though, drinks old and fine wine in a calm and aloof manner as he observes the performing seals that are his guests. There is an interesting irony that he, the tyrant of the feast, drinks wine of the quality used by the members of the Stoic opposition to celebrate the memory of the tyrant slayers of Roman history, Brutus and Cassius, the assassins of Julius Caesar. There are multiple layers of irony in every Juvenalian passage. Not only does Virro serve inferior wine to the social inferiors, but even the drinking vessels are inferior, while if perchance the jewelled goblet is handled by one of the poorest sort, a slave is appointed to ensure that no prying fingernail is used to extricate a gem. There is therefore no mutual trust or respect between patron and client, king and subject, if you like, emperor and citizen. Cicero, writing in the last days of the Republic, declared that adibenda est igitur quaedam reverentia adversus homines et optimi cuiusque et reliquorum, which means a certain amount of respect should be advanced to humankind, both of the better sort and the rest. So this idea that that would be an ideal. So Juvenal is declaring that all those good qualities have been sadly eroded. As well as inferior food, drink, and tableware, the poorer clients are dealt to by a different class of slave. If you look at verses 52 and following, Juvenal's racism and homophobia combine in a devastating fashion. Okay, a translation. Did I complain just now that you have different wine? Your water is different. And the service, you will receive your cup from some Saharan footman or the bony hand of a black-faced Moor, a character whom you would rather not meet in the middle of the night when driving uphill past the tombs on the Via Latina. The flower of Asia waits when our host bought for a figure beyond the assets of even our ancient royal kings. So catch your African Ganymede's eye when you need a drink. A lad who costs so many thousands cannot pour for a pauper. All the major houses are full of arrogant servants. Here's another grumbling audibly. He hands you some bread which is almost unbreakable, mouldy lumps of heavy dough which rattles your molars and resists every attempt at biting. Juvenal rubs in the fact that the handsome young slave that cost a king's ransom has a higher opinion of his own importance than that of the humble client who is truly inferior to a slave. The slave feels shame himself that he has to look to the needs of a freedman, or a free man who has no trace of shame left himself. At least the slave has no choice concerning his position or status, while the client willingly subjects himself to degradation, insult, and humiliation. As the meal continues, the indignities are compounded as inferior bread and oil is served to the inferiors, while the fish they receive looks as if it was raised in the waters of the great Roman sewer, the cloaca maxima, and I again quote the translation. Waiting for you is an eel, the long, thin water snake's cousin, or a greedy Tyler bass, covered with blotches, himself a slave reared by the banks and fed on the flood of the sewer, who can find its way right up the major drain, the cloaca maxima. The satirical poet's genius for identifying and utilizing the appropriately disgusting detail comes to the fore again. Some of the conspicuous consumption is reminiscent of Trimalchio's feast, but at least Trimalchio's guests were all treated to the same food and wine as their host, as were Nasiaeus' gift in the equivalent Horatian satire. Juvenal devoutly wishes that the host of his fifth satire should also treat his guests equally, whatever their status and fortune. For soon it becomes clear that the criteria of excellence on which Virro works, and which decides how he should treat his individual guests, is their personal wealth. Accordingly, wealth, luxuria, and its abuse, and avaritia, greed, are to the fore as targets of the satirist's rage, and are treated as symptoms and causes of the ills which are described. Finally, Juvenal describes the real motivation, which I've hinted at, behind Virro's behaviour. You imagine Virro's a chiseler, cheapskate? Hardly. He does it to make you suffer. For kicks. What farce or pantomime could be a better joke than your empty, rumbling belly? So, in case you didn't get it, his whole idea is to reduce you to tears of rage and endless grinding of teeth. You see yourself as a free man, a guest at the magnate's banquet, but he assumes you've been hooked by his kitchen's delectable odours, and he's not far wrong. No self-respecting person, whether born to the purple or homespun, however down and out, would endure that twice. So the client has become the rich man's buffoon. You can see that even from this brief sample from the literary field of Roman satire, that food, its use and abuse, figures largely. Even given the hyperbole, the gross exaggeration that is endemic in the genre of satire, it is clear that the uses and abuses of food and the ways in which it was served themselves as an entry into the complex social world of ancient Rome. On the other hand, we must remember that satire is by its nature prone to hyperbole and distortion. However, even hyperbole and distortion have to have some basis in fact. What the satirist clearly does is make volatile the uncritically received truths that too often are the foundations of traditional belief and behaviour. In this presentation of an alternative view, one of the major topics of Roman satire is the dinner party, as a kind of paradigm of both appropriate and inappropriate behaviour. But this is not true simply of ancient Roman literature. I'm sure that you people can think of occasions when consumption and serving of food figures largely in later literature and film. I randomly remembered when I was thinking this through again, 60s film, Tom Jones, some of you are old enough to remember it, where we had Albert Finney and Diane Cilento having a meal together as kind of vivid, gustatory foreplay to a night's exercise in love. Dickens, one of my other favourites, was a past master of utilising food, and I'll finish off by reading a description of a ghastly dinner party of the nouveau riche Veneerings, the lovely name, in Our Mutual Friend. So he's described the dining room. The great looking glass above the sideboard reflects the table and the company, reflects the new Veneering crest in gold and eke in silver, frosted and also forward, a camel of woolwork. The Herald's College found out a crusading ancestor for Veneering who bore a camel on his shield, or might have done, if he had thought of it. And a caravan of camels take charge of the fruits and flowers and candles and kneel down to be loaded with the salt. Reflects, the mirror, reflects Veneering, 40, wavy-haired, dark, tending to corpulence, sly, mysterious, filmy, a kind of sufficiently well-looking veiled prophet, not prophesying. Reflects Mrs. Veneering, fair, aquiline-nosed, and fingered, not so much light hair as she might have, gorgeous in raiment and jewels, enthusiastic, propitiatory, conscious that the corner of her husband's veil is over herself. Reflects Podsnap, prosperously feeding, two little light-coloured wiring wings, one on either side of his else bald head, looking as like his hairbrushes as his hair, dissolving view of red beads on his forehead, large allowance of crumpled shirt collar up behind. Reflects Mrs. Podsnap, fine woman for Professor Owen, quantity of bone, neck, and nostrils like a rocking horse. Hard features, majestic headdress in which Podsnap has hung golden offerings. Reflects Twello, dry, polite, susceptible to east wind, first gentleman Ewart, collar and cravat, cheeks worn in as if he had made a great effort to retire into himself some years ago, and had got so far and had never got any farther. Reflects mature young lady, raven locks and complexion that lights up well when well powdered, as it is, carrying on considerably in the captivation of mature young gentlemen, with too much nose in his face, too much ginger in his whiskers, too much torso in his waistcoat, too much sparkle in his studs, his eyes, his buttons, his talk, and his teeth. And so it goes on. I won't go on any longer with that, but it is great. And it just emphasizes that one example, and my example from Tom Jones, the continuing fascination with the dinner party as an into the levels of societal prejudice, ideas, aspirations, and so on. So that's probably time. It's 3/4 now, it's probably time enough for some questions and some discussion and some examples from your experience. I once said to a class that got a laugh that the only time, my wife will forgive me, the only time our house is tidy is when visitors are coming. So any questions? Quite happy to take any questions.
Could you please tell me again the name of that Fellini film? I'll try and trace it.
Yeah, it's called Fellini Satyricon.
Fellini Satyricon.
Yeah, F-E-L-L-I-N-I, Fellini Satyricon, yeah. It's a very interesting movie because the novel, the Satirica, or Satyricon, only survives in fragments. And the longest fragment is the Banquet of Trimalchio, which is depicted gloriously in the film. And Fellini recognizes so well that the film is based upon a fragmentary novel that the opening scene is of a mosaic, which is fractured and broken with pieces missing and so on. So it's quite a long and hard watch, but it's well worth seeing. Yeah. Any other questions? Yep.
Being that they're satirical, how much do they actually reflect what was eaten at the time?
Okay. So far as we can tell, the dishes that are described, for example, in Horace's dinner party, would be an accurate representation of what was eaten. In the Petronius, the novel, probably any of those dishes could be served, especially in the house and table of a very wealthy man, but perhaps not all at the same time. One of the guests says when Trimalchio goes out of the room, thank God, he says, I thought we'd finished, but we weren't in the beginning of the mountain, because more courses were brought in immediately, and so on. So yeah, the thing about satire is that, as I said, it's based on fact, but exaggerated often, and tweaked, so that you look at it through a different lens. And Kevin Glynn, who was a very fine scholar in American Studies here when we had American Studies, he did a study on media, and he talked about the unofficial media which volatilize the received truth. And so what the satirists are doing is volatilizing the received truth by looking at it through a different lens, looking at truth through a different lens. Doesn't mean to say it's untrue, but it just gives a different perspective, a different twist on things. Okay, does that help? Yep.
Do we have any literary evidence for a meal or dinner party which is not satirised?
Yeah, I think so. In Pliny's letters would probably give us there's certainly a letter in Pliny who's writing, actually no, at the end of the 1st century AD, where he says he always gives the same food to his ex-slaves as he does to himself. I can't remember from memory if he actually says what it is. There is a cookbook by Apicius, I remember, which gives you recipes and so on and so forth. And I think Horace's satire isn't the sort of extreme satire of Juvenal. And so when Horace describes the dinner party in Satire 2:6, and when he talks about the ideal dinner party, when it's noctes caenaeque deum, the nights and banquets of the gods, which he enjoys with his friends, he says you don't have to drink too much, you drink at your own pace, you don't play silly drinking games. And he talks about apples and so on, and yeah, kind of more, not so much humble fare, but not ostentatiously extracted fare. So yeah, we do have evidence of what was eaten. And I suppose the art historians here could tell me that we have images on plates and the mosaics and on pots and so on, yes, about the food that was eaten. A lot of fish was in it. And boars. Yeah, when the big boar was opened up, not only did thrushes fly out, but a great deal of sausages fell out looking like entrails. Trickery. Any other questions? Cheerio. No. Oh, there's...
Sorry, I've got another question.
Yeah, fine.
I read somewhere, and I forgot it there, that you brought a napkin with you to wrap up some goodies to take home with you. Is that true, or is that...
Well, the honest answer is I don't know. But what I would say is that in the banquet of Trimalchio, they certainly get takeaway gifts. So that would make sense, yeah. So one would imagine so.
Can you say this loud?
It's referred to in a form.
You bring the doggy back. Yeah.
If there are no further questions, can you join with me in thanking Roman?